My name's Dr. Jason Payne and I'm one of the criminologists at the university. Gavin and I work very closely together on a range of sociological and criminological topics, as well as teach the first year courses. Gavin teaches first year sociology and I teach first year criminology. But we're talking all the time about how we can better understand what's going on in our social world, how we can better understand what's going on in the real world by taking a far more complex and critical understanding of what's going on around us. Now, Gavin's given us a very good insight into the plethora of different ways in which we can understand our society, the many and varied ways within which we can interpret other people's behaviour, within which we can interpret our own behaviour, and the social forces and structures that give us an understanding of these things. In criminology, we're interested principally in how the things Gavin has given us, how those issues help to shape an understanding of crime, how they help to shape an understanding of why people commit crime, and how they help us to shape an understanding of who in our society are likely to be the most often victimised, the most often subject to the consequences of crime. And so criminology and sociology kind of go hand in hand, because in many respects we are trying to understand how it is that society creates situations, circumstances, and indeed individuals who do some of the most serious and heinous of acts that we're trying to understand and hopefully one day prevent. Now, what I want to do today is actually take you on a bit of a story. I want to take you on a story of this person. Does anyone recognise who this is? Kind of. I can see a hand up the back going, maybe, maybe not. Would you like to hazard a guess? Say again? Did you say the Joker? No, it's not. It's far closer to home. You as students, local students here in New South Wales and in Canberra, a person far closer to home than that. Any other ideas? Yes? No, it's not, but good try. This here, is Matthew Milat. A teenager not dissimilar in age to you, who some years ago took an axe and killed his friend, Daniel Ochdeloni. He did so in Belangolo State Forest, which just so happens to be the same location that his now infamously known uncle Ivan Milat was responsible for the backpacker murders. A young person not dissimilar in age to you has done something so tragic, so unimaginable, that it takes an understanding of his background and his circumstance, it takes an understanding of society to try and pick apart his story, to understand how these things occur. And that's what at university you do as a criminologist. You study the various different contributions, whether socially, individually, biologically or psychologically, to give us an understanding of why people commit not only the most serious of crimes in our community, but also the most boring and most mundane. Why do people steal a Mars bar from the shopping centre? Why do people put something extra into their shopping bag when they're at the electronic automated till? Why do people speed in their cars? Why do they ignore red lights or drink and drive? All the questions that as criminologists we're particularly interested in understanding. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Matthew Milat, because again, no doubt an interest in criminology oftentimes amongst young people like yourself is sparked by what you see on TV. The kind of crime scene investigation shows that show you the intricacies of forensic science, the nature of DNA testing, the notion of bullet forensics or blood splatter forensics, and all of that is very interesting and indeed a key part of understanding criminology. But there's much more to understanding the criminal mind. There's much more to understanding the criminal being than trying to understand what's in their nature, in their biology. And so we try and understand, not only using the words of the individuals, but also the nature and circumstances in which they grew up, in order to try and understand these very complex things. So I want to tell you a few things about Matthew Milat and show you how, as a criminologist at university, or as a sociologist for that matter at university, you would begin to develop a far more complex understanding of why these things occur. It's important to remember about Matthew Milat that in one of the statements he gave as a part of the investigation, as a part of the process of interviewing, was that he, A, wasn't alone, he was with a friend. He wasn't alone when he murdered Daniel Ochterlony, but he did consider himself, importantly, to be the ringleader of what was effectively his gang, if you will, this group of young kids who were often out either smoking pot or doing silly things, and he saw himself very much as the ringleader of that gang. And as criminologists or sociologists, we begin to bury ourselves in trying to understand the complexity of these things, in trying to understand what that means. And part of what it inspires in me as a criminologist is this interest in trying to understand how growing up in groups of friends, how these factors might influence our thoughts and our behaviours, how it might influence our willingness or otherwise to engage in criminal behaviour. And this particular comment given to us by Matthew Milat raises in me a whole raft of questions around social groups and peer influences, the kinds of things that right now you should be thinking about in terms of your own experience of being at school and the kinds of people that you're hanging out with and the kinds of influences sociologically that has. We know, importantly, that Matthew Milat was the nephew of Ivan Milat. And that leads to a very interesting question, does it not, about whether or not Matthew Milat was born to be a murderer. And I assure you that Channel 7 and Today Tonight and A Current Affair will almost certainly sell you this story that Matthew Milat was born to be a killer because his uncle had also committed so many serious and significant incidences. And it is true that as criminologists we are indeed interested in these questions. Is there a genetic tendency for some people to commit serious crime? Is it biologically determined? And how do we understand these influences in a broader context of the social environment in which we grow up? Criminologists, psychologists, and those who engage in a study and an understanding of criminology try to pick apart these things in a complex way. Try to give you something more than CSI or any of those crime scene investigation shows on TV will lead you to believe is all that you need to know about understanding criminal behaviour and indeed the criminal mind. What's important about the link between Matthew Milat and Ivan Milat is that they weren't actually biologically connected, right? Matthew Milat was not the immediate nephew, biological nephew of Ivan, and nor was his surname when he was born and when he grew up Milat, right? What's interesting to know about this case is that while everyone will sell you a story that Matthew Milat was born to be a killer, the reality is that there's no proof of a linkage in that way. And indeed, he wasn't even brought up to be a Milat. So it asks us the question, why did Matthew Milat change his name at the age of 17 to one of the most infamously known surnames in Australian cultural history? And what does this tell us about Matthew Milat's own identity, how he has internalised potentially his non-biological uncle's experience, situation and circumstances? To what extent has he internalised this into an identity that has helped to facilitate his own engagement in a fairly serious act? And what Today Tonight and all of these populist shows will not often engage you with, beyond the very simple people are born to be mad, are these very complex understandings of the way in which our behaviour is shaped by the people around us, the way in which our behaviour is shaped by the situations and social forces, as Gavin has already told us, that begin to dominate our pathway through life. You will no doubt have done this at school, the nature versus nurture argument. And in the Matthew Milat case, the evidence almost certainly is weighed towards the nurture argument rather than the nature argument. It is said that Matthew Milat didn't actually have a very happy upbringing, right? One thing that's often lost in the story of this serious crime is that he was brought up in a home environment that wasn't considered to be very happy or exciting, that wasn't considered to be very favourable to what we might call a pro-social behaviour, social behaviour that's considered normal or legal or conforming. And one of the things that sociologists and criminologists alike are very interested in when we begin to understand why crime occurs and why people might engage in it is to try and understand what influence our parents have on us. What influence does our upbringing have on us? What influence do the people who are formally involved in giving us the skills to operate in our social environment have on our behaviour going forward? And some people have argued that potentially Matthew Milat's otherwise serious involvement in a very horrible crime has been dictated in part by his experience as a young person growing up in an otherwise unfavourable environment. And these are very important things that sociologists and criminologists alike are interested in. He was not one of the cool kids by any stretch, and Matthew Milat, in fact, is quoted as saying this. He was considered a social outcast in his own school, and any other student that was spoken to as a result of the investigation of this particular crime said Matt was a bit strange, he wasn't part of the cool club, and so forth. And so we begin to talk again about not just the social forces of the groups Matthew was involved in, but also how other people can influence and shape our behaviour. So we talk here about social exclusion and inclusion and the consequences that has. Criminology is complex. Sociology is complex. It's far more complex than you'll ever see on the TV, and it's far more involved, and which is what makes it far more interesting than anything that the kind of populist view of criminology or sociology will give you. And at university, you get to explore these things in a very interesting and intricate way. I leave you with this as a reminder that the Matthew Milat story is certainly something that gets, I know, young people very interested in criminology. What you see on CSI gets you very interested in this notion of criminology. But criminology as a discipline is far more complex, and there are so many other different types of crimes, there are so many other different types of criminals that we're trying to understand, that as a young criminologist, if you come to university to study what we do, you begin to intersect with all of these different things in interesting and important ways. And I've got here just a few examples of the kinds of things that you delve into in criminology, but this is just really the tip of the iceberg in terms of the key areas that we like to engage you in. Finally, I'll say this to you, that criminologists aren't just people who are interested in crime, they're people who are interested in having skills in a whole range of different areas, including not only just sociology, but in other practical areas that you can gain access to at university. Criminologists can be designers, or the other way around, designers can be criminologists, right? Trying to implement a criminological understanding, why people commit crime, why people might decide to steal a bike, under what circumstances might that be possible, how do we prevent it, are all the kinds of things that designers these days are trying to build into how we prevent, how we protect ourselves as individuals, how do we stop people committing crime. So if you've got an interest in design, if you've got an interest in engineering, if you've got an interest in computer science, it doesn't mean you can't be a criminologist, or more importantly, it doesn't mean that as a criminologist you can't also be a designer, an engineer, or a computer scientist for that matter. Criminology is, and the study of crime, a core part of our daily life. It's about understanding how we structure our lives, not only to prevent ourselves from being a victim, but also about designing ways to prevent people from committing crime. And you can bring all sorts of perspectives to that from across a range of different disciplines. And at the ANU, you can really tackle all sorts of problems. But I'm going to ask you this and leave you with this question, is what are the problems that as a young person you today are currently facing that criminologists of my generation haven't necessarily been interested in? Because that's where, as a young criminologist or a young sociologist, you're going to be able to have your greatest impact. I give you a few examples that I think are important. Internet bullying or online bullying, right? It's not something that as a young person I experience. There was no Facebook in my day, there was no Twitter, there were no avenues for these kinds of things. But we know how tragic those things can actually be. An important question for criminologists. Sexting, the use of ice, synthetic drugs, all the kinds of things that young people get exposed to, the kinds of things that I hope as criminologists you might one day explore. Online privacy, violent extremism, all sorts of things that your generation will come to help us understand far better than our older generation criminologists that exist. And so I ask of this, what are you going to do at university to help us solve some of these key problems, to help us understand them in detail? And you can do that, of course, which is where I end, here at the ANU in various different ways, but in particular through our Bachelor of Arts in Sociology, our Bachelor of Arts in Criminology, and indeed our Bachelor of Criminology program, where you can really delve into some of these key issues, as well as combining those things with other core skills through a flexible double degree. And why wouldn't you do that? Thank you, everyone. That's criminology for you.